In 1994, the world was shocked by a case that gripped the nation and revealed the darkest depths of human behavior. Susan Smith, a seemingly ordinary mother from Union, South Carolina, reported that her two young sons, Michael and Alexander, had been abducted in a carjacking. For 9 days, the nation rallied to find the boys, only to learn a horrifying truth. Susan herself had driven her car into a lake, intentionally drowning her children. This case is a tragic tale of deception, mental health struggles, and a community left shattered. Let's dive into the details of this infamous case.
On October 25, 1994, Susan Smith made a tearful 911 call, claiming her car had been stolen at gunpoint by a black man. According to Susan, the carjacking occurred at a red light near John D. Long Lake in Union, South Carolina. She said her two sons, 3-year-old Michael and 14-month-old Alexander, were in the back seat when the alleged carjacker drove away. Susan's story immediately drew the attention of local authorities and national media. The Union community came together, organizing searches and vigils for the missing boys. News stations broadcast Susan's emotional pleas, where she begged the supposed abductor to return her children safely. Meanwhile, law enforcement set up roadblocks and interviewed locals, searching for any leads on the alleged carjacker. However, from the beginning, inconsistencies in Susan's account raised red flags for investigators. Surveillance footage didn't support her timeline, and there were no witnesses who saw the carjacking take place. Officers also noticed that Susan's demeanor fluctuated between intense grief and a calm detachment, which seemed unusual given the circumstances. As the search continued, the pressure mounted on Susan to clarify her story. Detectives worked tirelessly to piece together the timeline and cross-checked her statements against physical evidence. Her story began to unravel when investigators discovered that the route she claimed to have taken didn't align with witness reports or logical travel paths. On November 3, 1994, 9 days after reporting the disappearance of her children, Susan Smith confessed. She admitted that the carjacking was a fabrication and led investigators to John D. Long Lake. Divers found Susan's car submerged in the water, with Michael and Alexander still strapped into their car seats. The discovery was devastating for the community and the nation, which had rallied behind the search for the boys. Susan's confession revealed a chilling truth. She had driven to the lake, parked the car at the edge of the boat ramp, released the brake, and watched as the vehicle rolled into the water. She then walked away, crafting the false carjacking story to cover up her actions. Her admission shocked the nation, sparking outrage and disbelief. The public's response to Susan's confession was one of collective heartbreak and fury. Many struggled to comprehend how a mother could harm her own children. The racial element of her initial false claim added another layer of controversy, as it exploited stereotypes and shifted suspicion onto an innocent demographic. Community leaders and activists condemned her actions for perpetuating harmful biases. John D. Long Lake became a site of both mourning and outrage. Vigils were held near the lake as families and community members paid their respects to Michael and Alexander. Meanwhile, The media coverage intensified, delving into Susan's past, her family life, and the events leading up to the crime. Investigators began piecing together a motive that painted a darker picture of Susan's emotional state. Susan Smith's trial began in July 1995, capturing nationwide attention. The prosecution presented a case built on evidence, motive, and her chilling confession. They described Susan as a self-centered individual who viewed her children as obstacles to her happiness. At the heart of their argument was a letter Susan had written to a boyfriend, expressing her belief that their relationship could only succeed without the burden of children. The defense, however, painted a more nuanced portrait of Susan. They highlighted her troubled upbringing, including allegations of sexual abuse by her stepfather, which Susan had disclosed during her adolescence. They argued that her mental health struggles, including depression and feelings of rejection, contributed to her irrational decision. Expert witnesses testified about the psychological toll of her abusive past, framing her actions as the result of a mental breakdown rather than premeditation. Throughout the trial, the emotional weight of the case was palpable. Friends and family members of Michael and Alexander testified, sharing memories of the boys and the impact of their loss. The courtroom was often filled with tears as the defense and prosecution debated Susan's culpability and whether her actions warranted life imprisonment or a death sentence. A key point of contention was Susan's behavior leading up to the murders. The prosecution argued that her actions were calculated, pointing to her composed demeanor after the crime and the elaborate fabrication of the carjacking story. Meanwhile, the defense countered that Susan's emotional instability and history of trauma impaired her judgment and led her to act in desperation. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before delivering their verdict. Susan Smith was found guilty of 2 counts of murder. On July 28, 1995, she was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. The sentence reflected the gravity of her crime while allowing for the potential acknowledgement of her mental health struggles. The case had far-reaching consequences, sparking discussions about mental health, maternal filicide, and racial bias. Susan's false claim about a black carjacker intensified scrutiny of racial stereotypes in criminal investigations. Many criticized how her lie initially diverted resources and fostered unjust suspicion within the community. The tragedy also shed light on the pressures and challenges of motherhood, particularly for individuals struggling with mental health issues. Advocacy groups used the case as a platform to call for better access to mental health care, emphasizing the need for early intervention and support for at-risk mothers. Susan's life in prison has continued to draw attention. She has faced multiple disciplinary actions for rule violations, including engaging in inappropriate relationships with prison staff. Despite these incidents, Susan remains eligible for parole in 2024, though public sentiment and the severity of her crimes make her release unlikely. The legacy of the Susan Smith case is complex and deeply emotional. It serves as a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of untreated mental health issues and the societal need to address these challenges with empathy and understanding. Decades later, the memories of Michael and Alexander Smith endure, symbolizing the innocent lives lost in a tragedy that continues to provoke reflection and discussion.
Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're doing a deep dive into a case that captivated the nation, the Susan Smith case. And I know a lot of you have been requesting this one. It's a case with a frantic mother, a nationwide search and media frenzy, really like nothing we've seen before.
Yeah, I think what really got people, especially parents, was that this case played on our deepest fears. You know, this idea of random violence and innocent children being taken. It's like every parent's worst nightmare come true.
It really is. And initially, the public was very supportive of Susan Smith, Everyone wanted those boys found safe. But then things took a dark turn.
Yeah, and that's where the case starts to get really complex. Like from the beginning, there were inconsistencies in her story. The investigators noticed these red flags right away. Like the surveillance footage from where the carjacking was supposed to have happened didn't line up with Susan's timeline.
There's always those little details that don't add up.
Right.
And I remember reading that investigators use behavioral analysis to look for subtle cues that might indicate deception. Do they use those techniques here?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Experienced investigators are trained to look for these subtle inconsistencies in a person's story. Their body language and emotional responses. And it's not about catching someone in a lie. It's about seeing the big picture. And in this case, those subtle cues and the lack of evidence for Susan's claims started to show a very different story.
It must have been so hard for investigators to reconcile those inconsistencies with the public's view of Susan as a grieving mother. Was there a lot of outside pressure during those early stages?
Oh, there's always pressure in these high-profile cases, especially when the media's all over it and the public's outraged. It can be hard to stay objective and follow the evidence, but I gotta give it to them. The investigators in this case really stuck to the process, carefully piecing together all the evidence.
And one piece that was missing was the lack of any witnesses to the carjacking.
Right. You'd think with someone taking a car with 2 young children inside, someone at that busy intersection would have seen something. That lack of witnesses made investigators even more suspicious.
So we have a story that's not adding up, no witnesses, and mounting pressure on Susan. What happened next?
Well, as the investigation went on, detectives started noticing that Susan's demeanor would change a lot. She would be totally distraught one minute, crying her eyes out for her children, and then strangely detached the next. This inconsistency in her emotional responses really raised doubts about her story.
It's fascinating how those small behavioral cues can be so important. It's like a mind game between the investigators and the person they're interviewing.
It is, in a way. Good investigators don't just listen to what's said, but they watch how it's said. Body language, micro-expressions, and if their emotions line up with their story, it's a complicated process.
So investigators are starting to suspect Susan's story isn't what it seems. What was the turning point? When did the truth come out?
The turning point came 9 days after Susan first reported her children missing.
9 days. That must have felt like forever to everyone involved, especially those hoping for the best.
I bet. What happened next shocked the whole nation. After days of questioning, Susan confessed. She admitted she made up the whole carjacking story. There was no kidnapper.
Wow. That must have been a huge shock. How did the public react?
It was like everything people thought they knew was flipped on its head. The nation went from praying for those boys to be safe to facing this horrible truth. Their mother had killed them.
I can only imagine the shock and horror. It's hard to wrap your head around something like that. Did she explain why she did it?
Susan led investigators to John D. Long Lake. That's where they found her car underwater with her 2 sons, Michael and Alexander, still strapped into their car seats.
Oh my God. That's just devastating. And to think their own mother.
It really is heartbreaking. And as they investigated more, the motive behind Susan's actions became even more disturbing.
I remember reading about this, but can you remind me of the details?
Well, the prosecution said Susan wanted to get rid of her kids because she was seeing a rich guy who didn't want children.
This is the part where I just can't understand. To see your own children as obstacles, it's just so hard to grasp.
It's a chilling thought, isn't it, to think someone could put their own desires above the lives of their children. And that brings us to one of the most debated parts of this case, Susan Smith's mental state.
Right. The defense argued that Susan wasn't a cold-blooded killer, but a troubled woman who had suffered a lot in her life. They said she was a woman driven to a desperate act by mental illness and tragic circumstances. What's your take on that? What evidence did they use?
The defense really focused on Susan's past, her history of depression, suicide attempts, and the sexual abuse she allegedly experienced from her stepfather. They argued that these traumas, combined with her mental state, led to this tragic act. They said it wasn't malice or wanting to get rid of her kids for personal gain.
So we're seeing two very different stories here. On one side, the prosecution says she's manipulative and saw her kids as inconvenient. And then, the defense says she was a victim of her past, driven to this by a fragile mental state. It must have been a tough job for the jury to figure out which Susan Smith was the real one.
It definitely was, and that's what made this trial so fascinating for the country. It wasn't just about guilty or not guilty. It was about trying to understand why people do the things they do, the terrible effects of mental illness, and the gray areas in the justice system.
It sounds like this case was about way more than just the crime itself. It brought up some serious social issues and debates that continue today.
You're right. The Susan Smith case forced America to face some hard truths about race, mental health, and the struggles families go through behind closed doors. And those discussions are just as relevant today as they were back then.
This is where things get really interesting, and I want to dig into those bigger issues. But first, let's take a quick break. We'll be right back to continue our deep dive into the Susan Smith case.
The trial was a huge media event. The courtroom was packed. Every little detail, every word from the witnesses, every emotional moment was broadcast to the whole country.
It felt like the whole country was on trial, too. Everyone's struggling with these questions of responsibility and justice, trying to figure out how to feel about this whole thing.
Yeah, exactly. And as the trial went on, the prosecution presented their case step by step, building this narrative of Susan as being very calculated and manipulative. They brought up how she seemed cold in the days after the kids disappeared, the things in her story that didn't add up, and how she didn't seem sorry at first.
It's crazy how those first impressions can be so strong, even when there's evidence that contradicts them. Do you think the prosecution was trying to play on those first impressions on purpose, or were they just showing the facts as they saw them?
It's tough to say for sure, but like in any big case, there's a strategy to it, right?
Yeah.
Prosecutors got to present a story that the jury believes and backs up their side. And in this case, they focused on painting a picture of Susan as a woman who could do something so cruel.
And on the other side, you had the defense attorneys trying to show Susan as a human being to help the jury see her not as a monster, but as a woman who had problems and had been let down by the system, her family, and her own mental health.
The defense had a really tough job. They had to acknowledge that the crime was awful, but they also had to get the jury to feel some sympathy for their client. They had witnesses talk about Susan's history of depression, her suicide attempts, and the sexual abuse she said she suffered. Their argument was that all this trauma, plus her mental state, created a situation that led to this terrible act.
It's interesting because on the surface, it sounds like the prosecution and the defense were telling totally opposite stories about Susan. But at the core of both of their arguments was this idea of her being deeply hurt, even though it's in very different ways.
That's a sharp observation, and it shows how complex this case was. There's no simple answer, no black or white. It's a story about how fragile people are, about how trauma can last a lifetime, and about how we all struggle to make sense of something so awful.
It sounds like the jury had a huge responsibility. They had to sort through all this evidence, these different stories, and make a decision about Susan's future. How long did it take them to reach a verdict?
Less than 3 hours.
Wow. That's incredibly fast, especially for such a serious case.
It is. And it shows how powerful the evidence was and how convincing the stories told during the trial were. The jury found Susan Smith guilty of 2 counts of murder.
What was her sentence?
Life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 30 years.
So even though the trial ended, Susan Smith's story didn't just disappear. People kept talking about her, and her case kept generating debate and discussion.
Yeah, and one of the biggest parts of that discussion was racial bias, something you mentioned earlier. Susan's lie about a black carjacker had a huge impact, not just on the investigation, but on the whole conversation about race and justice in America.
It's disturbing to think about how that lie played into existing stereotypes and might have put other black men in danger. I remember how some of the national news coverage back then focused so much on what Susan said about a black carjacker and didn't really question the holes in her story.
It's a sad example of how racial bias can affect everything in our society, from what people think to what the media shows to how law enforcement works. And it shows how much we need to be aware, hold people accountable, and change the system.
The Susan Smith case also put a spotlight on maternal filicide, which is when a mother kills her child, a topic that people often don't want to talk about. It forced people to face the fact that mothers, even though we have this perfect image of them, can hurt their children.
And it made us think beyond simple explanations and consider the complicated things that can lead to tragedies like this. The Susan Smith case started an important conversation about postpartum depression, the pressure and isolation a lot of mothers feel, and the need for mental health help and support.
It's like this case, even though it was horrible, was a wake-up call. It made us acknowledge the struggles women face that we don't see, how bad our mental health care system is, and how much racial bias is everywhere. But it also pushed people to be more understanding and compassionate, which is something good that came out of such a sad situation.
It's important to remember that Susan Smith's case isn't unique. Sadly, there are many other women who are suffering silently, facing similar challenges, and maybe don't have the support they need. This case should remind us that we need to create a culture where asking for help is seen as a strong thing to do, not a weakness.
I completely agree. We should be more proactive about addressing the root causes of these tragedies, not just reacting after they've happened. What can we do as a society to better support mothers and families who might be struggling?
There's a lot we can do. We can start by making sure everyone can get affordable mental health care, giving more resources to new parents, and building supportive communities where people feel comfortable talking about their problems without being judged. We also need to fix the systemic issues that contribute to these problems, like poverty, the lack of affordable childcare, and the pressure society puts on mothers that often leaves them feeling overwhelmed and alone.
It sounds like we need to tackle this from all sides, focusing on the needs of individuals and the bigger societal problems that lead to these tragedies. And it's not just about preventing future tragedies, it's about creating a world where all mothers and families feel cared for and supported.
Absolutely. And it's about understanding that being a mother isn't the same for everyone. It's a journey with good times and bad times, and every woman's experience is different. We need to move away from these perfect ideas of motherhood and make space for women to be honest about their struggles and ask for help without feeling ashamed.
This is where I think the Susan Smith case gets even more complicated. Because while we see the need for societal change and more support for mothers, we also have to face the fact that Susan Smith made a choice, a horrible choice that took the lives of her own children. How do we reconcile those two things?
That's the big question, isn't it? And there's no easy answer. It's a constant back and forth between recognizing the systemic problems that contribute to these tragedies and making people take responsibility for their actions. We can understand someone's struggles while still acknowledging that their choices have serious consequences.
It's a delicate balance, and one that we as a society are still trying to figure out. But it's an important conversation to have because it gets to the heart of who we are as people, how we define justice, and how we build a world where both accountability and compassion can exist.
Well put. And since we're talking about accountability, there's another aspect of the Susan Smith case we haven't talked about yet. Her life in prison and the fact that she might be eligible for parole soon.
That's right. Even though the trial happened years ago, her story isn't over. What are your thoughts on her possibly being released? How might that affect the victims' families, the community, and the whole country?
That's a question that will definitely bring back the debate around this case. On one side, some people believe she should never be let out of prison, that her crime means she should stay locked up for life. They say that letting her out on parole would be a betrayal of justice and disrespect the memory of Michael and Alexander.
I imagine the victims' families are probably terrified of her getting out, of having to relive the trauma of that time all over again.
I'm sure they are. The thought of their mother's killer possibly being free must be incredibly painful and scary for them. And it brings up important questions about why we punish people, whether people can really change, and what true justice really means.
And on the other side are those who believe in second chances, who say everyone deserves another shot, even someone who's done something so awful.
It's complicated, with no easy answers. It makes us think about basic questions of human nature, whether people can change, and how much we can forgive.
The Susan Smith case really makes us think hard about these things, doesn't it? It's not just a true crime story. It's about human nature, about the choices we make, the things that happen because of those choices, and the power of both hope and despair. It's a story that people are still thinking about decades later.
It reminds us that some stories never really end. They just keep going, showing us new layers of complexity and making us question our own beliefs.
And that's what makes these deep dives so interesting, right? We're not just uncovering the facts of a case. We're exploring what it means to be human, the things that influence our lives, and the choices that make us who we are.
I agree. And in Susan Smith's case, the choices she made had terrible consequences that still affect people today and started a national conversation that's still going on. It's a story that makes us face our own biases, our own potential for good and evil, and how we understand justice and forgiveness.
You know, as we're talking about this, it hits me that even with all the media coverage, all the analysis, all the debates, at the center of this case are two little boys whose lives were cut short, Michael and Alexander. We shouldn't forget their names. We should remember them and recognize their loss as the huge tragedy that it is.
You're absolutely right. It's easy to get caught up in the legal stuff, the psychology, the impact on society. But we can't forget about the human cost of this crime. 2 innocent lives were lost, and we can't ever forget that.
Their story reminds us how important mental health awareness is, how much we need to show compassion and support people who are struggling, and how devastating it can be when despair takes over.
It reminds us that we all need to do better, as individuals and as a society, to create a world where kids are safe, where families have support, and where mental health is treated with the same urgency and compassion as physical health.
That's a powerful message, and I hope our listeners will think about it. But before we finish, I want to leave everyone with a question to think about as we move on from our deep dive into the Susan Smith case.
I'm always up for a good question to make people think more.
Think about this. How has our understanding of mental health, especially postpartum depression, changed since the Susan Smith case? And what more can we do to help mothers and families who are facing similar struggles? It feels like we could talk for hours about this. There's just so much to unpack. But I think you've given us a lot to consider, especially with that last question.
It's a question that's worth thinking about for sure. Our understanding of postpartum depression has come a long way since Susan Smith's case, that's for sure. Back then, people didn't really get it. They thought it was just baby blues or something.
Right. Like moms should just be happy, and if they're not, well, something's wrong with them.
Exactly. Thankfully, things are different now. Postpartum depression is recognized as a real medical condition, one that needs treatment and support.
And it's not just about recognizing the symptoms. It's about making women feel comfortable enough to actually talk about it, to ask for help, and to get the care they need without being judged.
Yeah. One of the best things to come out of this is that more women are speaking up, sharing their stories, and fighting for better resources.
It's like we're finally breaking through that silence
Mm-hmm.
and replacing it with, support and understanding.
Exactly. That's so important because when women feel alone, it just makes things worse. It's harder to ask for help.
So what can we do as individuals and as a society to, create that support system?
Well, we can start by learning about postpartum depression, what it looks like, what the symptoms are. We can check in on the new moms in our lives, offer to listen and help out. Just encourage them,
Show them they're not alone in this.
Yeah.
And that, it's okay to not be okay.
Exactly. And as a society, we need policies that actually help mothers and families. Things like paid leave for parents, affordable childcare, and access to good mental health care. That can make a huge difference.
We need to be there for families before they're in crisis. And we need to understand that investing in mothers and children is an investment in our future.
I completely agree. We can't change what happened, but we can learn from cases like Susan Smith's and work towards preventing these kinds of tragedies from happening again.
It's a reminder that even in these really dark stories, there's always a possibility for healing and growth. Susan Smith's case might always be the symbol of terrible loss, but it can also be something that pushes us to make things better.
I like that. It has been a really thought-provoking deep dive. And to our listener, keep learning about this case. Look into the resources that are out there and talk about mental health in your community. Even small actions and showing you care can make a big difference.
I couldn't have said it better myself. And that wraps up our deep dive into the Susan Smith case. Thanks for listening, everyone. We'll be back soon with another fascinating story.